Hi, everyone. As people are starting to file in, we're just going to run through a couple of the housekeeping rules for today's event. First, want to thank you all and welcome you here. If you are in need of closed captions, we have a live closed captioner who can provide that for you. If you just click the CC button at the bottom of your screen, that will enable you to view live captions. We will be recording today's event, and the recording will be going on the Ada Lovelace website afterwards, usually within about 24 hours. So if you missed anything, do not worry. You can still access it later. The other thing to say is that we will not be able to see or hear you as a participant or as a viewer today, but if you do have a question, very much encourage you to put it in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll do our best to work those in throughout the webinar. And lastly, if you are following on Twitter or Mastodon, we are there. We are at Ada Lovelace Inst, and would love to continue the conversation there afterwards. Thanks so much, everyone. I'm going to hand it now over to Dame Wendy Hall.
Thanks, Andrew. Lovely to, well, I was going to say see you all, unfortunately. Really great that you joined this afternoon. It's great to have our panelists here. I'm going to introduce them later. Just to remind us all why we're here, I don't need to really remind anyone here that AI and data-driven research are raising new kinds of challenges for existing research ethics processes. As you can say that again, right? It's a huge issue for us all to think about. Essential to get the mechanisms for ethical review right and to open discussion between different research organizations into how they can better address ethical risks. And this report from the Ada Lovelace Institute, which I'm proudly the chair of, the Alan Turing Institute and the University of Exeter's Institute for Data Science and AI have come together to look at how research ethics committees and corporate and academic labs have addressed the problem and create some recommendations for how they can improve. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. And before that, Andrew and Melaine are going to briefly present the report's findings. We'll then have a discussion with our panel of experts. I'll introduce them all to you at the time, answering some questions from me and from the authors to explore the issues further. And then you can put things in the Q&A and we'll pick up on those if at all possible in the time allowed. So I'm now going to hand over to Andrew, or who's kicking off, or Melaine?
Thanks so much, Wendy. I'll first hand over to Melaine to kick us off with an introduction to the report.
Yeah, thanks very much, Andrew. Welcome everyone. It's great to see you again. I'm Melaine, so I'm currently a lecturer at Bristol University focusing on responsible design and innovation, previously at Ada, where this report came from. Okay, so let's get started. So I will now talk for a few minutes about the context of this research. So what motivated us and why it matters. So I will then hand over to Andrew, who will talk about our recommendations. So here on the first slide, there have been several sort of controversial, high-profile examples of unethical research that raises the question of their potential impact on people in society. So one example featured here on this slide is the use of facial recognition to determine whether someone is gay. So to address this problem, the largest conference of AI, the Conference on Neural Information Processing Systems, or NeurIPS, has introduced that submissions must adhere to ethical standards for responsible research practice. And they also introduced the requirement to include a discussion about potential negative societal impacts of the proposed research. So which you can see here on the right. Okay, next slide. So this matters as there has been a significant increase in AI and data science research, as you see illustrated here by this chart over the last 10 years or so. Next slide. At the same time, there has also been an increase in non-peer-reviewed publications, which again raises the concerns around their review. Next slide. So research ethics committees are the institutional bodies who usually review research projects. However, we found that RECs face significant governance and fragmentation issues in their decision-making process. So for example, the outcome of research projects presented to different RECs can vary significantly. So here we see also more cross-country collaboration, again, raising the question as to the complexity of potential ethics review processes for these projects. For example, ethics review processes may take place across different institutions in different countries who may have very different legal requirements or ethical norms and standards, which leads to inconsistent outcomes. Next slide. We can also see an increase in public-private research, which is common in biomedical research, again, which also points to the difficulty on how these projects are actually reviewed. Here, research projects also have to navigate an equally complex and fragmented landscape of ethical standard norms and regulations. Next slide. We also start to see that AI and data science is starting to affect other disciplines, such as genomics or history, which makes it even more important to think about ethics review processes across disciplines. Next slide. So as I mentioned earlier, research ethics committees are primarily responsible for reviewing AI and data science research. However, there are some challenges in terms of their structure, their composition, and their processes. For example, research projects are reviewed based on principles from biomedical research and data protection only once at the start of the research. However, adverse effects on people and society may occur further down the research pipeline and are often not apparent at the beginning of a research project. RECs also tend to focus on the research subjects and potential harms through the research methodology, but they do not consider broader societal impact beyond the research subject, such as long-term harms to particular population groups or communities. So as we mentioned earlier, RECs also come in different sizes and have different expertise and therefore differ substantially in terms of the outcomes of ethical review processes. Okay, next slide. So, this is now about our project. So I briefly want to talk about our approach for this report and our methods. So the overall aim was to understand how institutional RECs are currently assessing AI and data science research and the challenges they face. So for example, we looked first at the challenges. So what are the most pressing or common kinds of issues for RECs that they are dealing with in the context of AI research? And then the structures, how are corporate and academic RECs currently structured to deal with these issues? Their limitations. So what are the limitations of the review process? How does that fit into the wider ecosystem of research ethics? And finally, the changes. So what changes would need to occur within RECs and also in the wider research ecosystem to address those challenges? So to answer these questions, we basically started with an extensive literature review on AI data science research and the ethics challenges. We then convened 2 workshops, as you remember, with 40 members of research ethics committees at both public and private institutions. And we also did 9 interviews with experts in REC operations and research ethics. Also, we developed 6 hypothetical case studies for training purposes. So I hand over to Andrew to discuss some of our recommendations.
Thanks so much, Milan. So again, a lot of the Congress report was looking at how RECs are dealing with the kinds of challenges that AI and data science raise. And the first thing we tried to identify were what are some of the most common challenges that they're looking at. We have a lot that we could to talk about, but just for simplicity's sake, we're going to pull out 4 that were the most critical ones that can shape the discussion we're about to have today. And one of the biggest ones should be unsurprising. It's resource and expertise challenges. Many research ethics committees often lacked the resources, expertise, and training to appropriately address the risks that AI and data science research can pose. That included a training in the kinds of ethical issues that can arise in data-driven research. It can include different kinds or lack of interdisciplinary expertise on their panels, very different review requirements between different committees, and also major challenges, as Milan touched on, around more multi-site and public-private partnerships, leading to multi-site studies that would have inconsistent decision-making. The example on the right-hand side actually was from a case study that we looked at that was relating to a data set that was from a Chinese research institution that was a joint project with a Western university. It had passed ethics review in the Chinese institution, but had failed to pass in the European institution. And again, kind of exhibits a really recurring trend of why it's important to get these decisions right and accurate and consistent as possible to avoid time wasting and wrong decisions. A second challenge we identified was just that existing principles for research ethics review are often not well suited to AI and data science research. They are drawn from the biomedical sciences, which assume a type of research subject relationship that doesn't really exist in data-driven research. It's more of a data subject researcher relationship, which has very different kinds of proximity between the researcher and the subject. And that affects all kinds of ways in which questions of autonomy, privacy, and consent are understood. It is represented in ways that data can be reused, where consent issues may be very unclear. And it also raises challenges for inferential information that can be inferred from the linkage of multiple data sets together. Another issue that arose that we kind of identified very quickly was there's a lot of activity around the development of AI ethics principles. There are over 90 of these principles worldwide at the moment, but many of these have been pretty much entirely developed from the perspective of AI products. How do you create products in a very ethical way? And none of these frameworks to date have been agreed upon, let alone translated into principles specifically for AI or data science research. So there's a real sense that many RACs struggle to understand how should they be using these ethical principles that are floating around from the not transgovernmental to the institutional level. A third challenge we identified was that RACs often do not evaluate the full range of algorithmic harms that can arise. As Melinda mentioned, these reviews are ex ante before research begins, and they're oftentimes focused specifically on the methodology for how research should be conducted. To give an example of this, there was a research project that was used to predict the proteins of a variety of different new chemicals or new drugs. That same research was then used to be able to predict over 40,000 possible new chemical weapons in a very short amount of time. Now, I acknowledge that that's not the same thing as creating chemical weapons, because there's still major roadblocks around the access to wet labs, but it's the kind of consideration of research that oftentimes is not considered by review committees. They're not looking at the broader subtle impact implications of research. What they tend to be looking at are issues of methodology. And that raises all kinds of challenges where issues around societal discriminatory issues, around privacy concerns that might arise downstream, around data labor issue concerns, or even environmental concerns are oftentimes missing from reviews of research. And those tend to be the kinds of issues that are most of concern by members of the public, by governments, and by regulators. So again, a challenge here that there's just not enough of review of downstream bigger picture issues. And a fourth challenge was this issue that came up in quite a few discussions around corporate lab ethics review processes, many of which have often lacked transparency in both internally for how researchers should be conducting themselves, but also externally for people who are partnering with them. We heard from a few people who described it as a challenge when they're partnering with a private lab that they don't quite understand what the review process might include, and if it's the same consistency as the kind they might be facing. We also heard concerns from some researchers that ethics review processes or acting ethically cannot necessarily be rewarded, particularly in labs that have an incentive to really push research for commercial purposes. And there's no greater example of this than the challenges that happened in 2020, where Timnit Gebru and Margaret Mitchell were both fired from Google over challenges to the review process for research into large language models. Now, the challenges we identified led to some recommendations that we also felt were worthwhile making that kind of looked at how you can change and adapt RAC processes to better address these issues. And one of those recommendations is to incorporate more broader impact thinking in research ethics reviews. We're very excited to have Quinn Weiss here, who is from Stanford University, who can talk a bit about this process that they are using or experimenting with, the Ethics Society review process. But it offers a really good example of how you can try to incorporate more consideration for downstream risks in the ethical review process in a way that researchers find very helpful. A second challenge that we wanted to look at, a recommendation, was around multi-stage ethics reviews, particularly for high-risk research. This would be a different type of review that doesn't just occur before research begins, but also comes back to review research for different kinds of risks at different stages. And it's an idea that many others in the field, from Brent Hecht to others, have called upon as a really good practice to move towards. It could involve some initial kind of impact assessment at the research stage, a proper traditional research ethics review at the research development stage, perhaps even with a review for data ethics issues by a separate committee, another review at pre-publication, and potentially even a review post-publication to look at sort of a retrospective of what kinds of issues actually did arise and which ones didn't. And the more you can share those kinds of retrospective lessons learned, the more that the field as a whole can better guess and assess what are the kinds of risks that they might consider in future kinds of research. A third recommendation was around interdisciplinary expertise and training. This involves creating more review boards that have different kinds of experiential expertise, so lay members on them, people who come from very different backgrounds. But it also involves creating what we call institutional training hubs, both for research ethics committee members and students to share information, resources, and case studies of good practice. And the 6 case studies that we developed, so the hypothetical ones, are meant to be part of a training hub to provide a pedagogical tool for testing out different ethics review examples. A fourth recommendation was aimed at specifically at corporate labs and around this challenge around transparency, really pushing them to publish the review criteria and to consult with more external experts in ethical review issues. And I just want to give a really big call out to DeepMind for some really excellent examples of how to do this. When they released AlphaFold, from recent blog posts they wrote, they described consulting with over 25, I believe, different experts and the kinds of ethical issues that can arise, and using that to inform their release strategy. And that's a really excellent example of the kinds of ways in which you can, as a lab, take that risk to become a bit more open and consultative in your work. It'd be great to see more of that in the field. And lastly, our main recommendation is really around incentives and this notion of ecosystem building. In the research ecosystem, you have a range of different actors, each of whom are setting incentives for the others to follow. So the more that funders can incentivize broader impact and ethical thinking in funding calls, the more that journal editors and conference organizers can incentivize that thinking, the more likely it is to occur. We're already seeing wonderful examples of that at places like NeurIPS or ICML, which are requiring ethics impact statements or some kind of broader impact thinking. And it's also an opportunity to consider the creation of some kind of Belmont 2.0 principles for AI research, a way for a collective body like the National Ethics Commission in Europe, or even UKRI here in the UK, to think about ways in which you can create some common principles that adapt the AI ethics standards or principles that are out there into practice and guidance for research ethics committees to follow. There's loads of other things from the report that I'd love to talk about, but I've taken enough of your time. I'm really excited to move to the panel discussions and build on some of these themes, and I'll hand it back to you, Wendy.
Mute. Thank you. I don't know if anyone noticed, I dropped out in the middle of that. My system just black blocked me out. Anyway, I'm back, thank heavens. That was amazing, very fast run through. Before I introduce the panelists, I want to say a couple of things. When I talk about to people about ethics committees, this is a huge issue, and your point about we mostly get to do them. It happens at my university. They're initially set up on the basis of what happens in biomedical sciences, which doesn't, some of which applies and a lot of which doesn't here. I, of course, was around at the beginning of the World Wide Web, and I always say to my students, well, if Tim Berners-Lee had written a research proposal proposing the World Wide Web, would it have got through your ethics committee? Now, I do know that he wrote several proposals, none of them got through because they were technically reviewed as either being uninteresting or not doable. Something like that. I mean, he never got any research money to do the World Wide Web, he just put it out. But, you know, when you think about what's happened with the web, how much of that could we have foreseen 30 odd years ago in terms of the ethics of what the World Wide Web might have given us? And the other one, just looking today contemporarily, if OpenAI had put forward a research proposal on GPT or ChatGPT or whatever, you know, how large language models, How would you review that on an ethics committee? The problem with this area, and this is what I'm hoping the panel will pick up on, is there's such, I mean, DeepMind, for heaven's sake, looking at Dawn there, they're dealing with issues that are so far-reaching. We have no idea what's going to happen. So this is a really, really tough area. I'm going to introduce the panel now. I would like to say you've got a fantastic panel together, Andrew. Each one of our panelists I would like to have a whole lecture from, but they've got a few minutes each to answer some questions that you've very carefully scripted. So I'm just going to go through, because we're going to I'm going to follow Andrew's script and ask questions to different panelists. We've got Dawn Blockswich, who's from DeepMind, Director for Pioneering Responsibly. That's so appropriate for this panel. Dawn works on operationalizing ethics and safety within DeepMind. Having worked at a number of tech companies, I bet you're glad at DeepMind and not being chucked out of Microsoft at the moment, from IBM to Salesforce, so maybe not Microsoft. She's been core to setting up DeepMind's internal governance around ethics and safety, which has included overseeing how DeepMind's operating principles are embedded in the day-to-day operations of the organization. And your boss, Demis Hassabis, has been talking about all this quite a lot in the news over the last few days. It's a big topic, and how you're going to beat ChatGPT. Then we've got Madhu. I have a sister-in-law called Madhu, but Mudalaika Srikuma, who's program lead at another partnership in AI, which I'd love to know more about as an organization. But anyway, Madhu leads the Safety Critical AI program at the Partnership on AI. Through research and convenings, the program engages stakeholders to develop and advance norms for responsible publication of AI research to keep pace with breakthrough capabilities. Most recently, Madhu's work appeared in Nature Machine Intelligence. Well done, calling for community alignment on ethics review practices. Then we have Quinn. Oh, you are challenging me with my pronunciation today. Good job I was a dean. Quinn Weiss, program director at CASBS. I had to look that up. That's the Center for Advanced Studies in the Behavioral Sciences. I maybe shouldn't have had to look it up, but it's at Stanford. I didn't know what the acronym was, but Quinn is program director at, how do you pronounce that? Or is it just CASBS?
CASBS.
CASBS, you do try and pronounce the acronym. Thank you. And CASBS, they manage some of the programs and projects at CASBS, that's what you do, including ethics and society review. Their research interests focus on how to foster ethical and socially responsible research, how researchers think about the societal consequences of their work, and the role of institutions and incentive structures in shaping unethical research. Next time I'm at Stanford, can I come visit you?
Absolutely.
I'd love to hear more about your work. We have Nick, and then we now our last two panelists were actually co-authors of the report. We have Niccolo Tempini, who's a senior lecturer in data studies at the University of Exeter. Niccolo is a researcher interested in understanding how society changes in association with the diffusion of digital information technology and data. Is also a fellow at the Alan Turing Institute. And last but by no means least, possibly the hardest to Ishmael, is it Ishmael? Yay! Karubi Garcia, who's the founder of, now how do you pronounce your company then? Kairoi?
Kairoi sounds good to me.
Oh, fantastic. You see, what deans have to read out all the names at graduation, right? So it's good guesses a lot of the time. Ishmael is the founder of Kairoi, a company supporting organizations that develop artificial intelligence tools and conduct AI research to do so responsibly and thoughtfully. Well, congratulations again, Andrew, on bringing, and Melaine, if it was Melaine, bringing all these people together. So now, guys, it's your turn to work. And we have a script, and I'm going to stick to it because it's what you've prepared for, but we can go off-piste a little bit. And if any other panelists want to jump in, please, raise your hand in the usual manner. So the first question, which I assume Quinn and Dawn have prepared some answers for, because I'm going to ask Quinn and then Dawn, is about the scope of research ethics committees. This is the scope of research ethics committees review. So looking at the challenges that research ethics committees are facing with AI and data science research, and as I said, they are huge. When should an REC review begin and end? Not sure what you mean there, but anyway, you can answer it how you like. What questions should an REC review address? As I say, you can answer that exactly how you like. We'll go to Quinn first and then to Dawn.
Thank you so much. So I think a lot of my recommendations may follow from the Ada Lovelace report just recapped here. One way that these processes could look would be something like the Ethics and Society review that I manage, where in order for researchers to access grant funding, they have to go through an ethics review process with a panel of interdisciplinary experts. Of course, we want these reviews to occur throughout the life cycle of the research and extend beyond after the research has concluded, because there are unknown unknowns that we don't see until the research has left the lab, so to speak. In the context of the EU research program like Horizon Europe, I know that ethics reviews are often triggered first by a self-assessment. And I think we want to ensure that ethics experts are involved from the beginning, as even well-meaning researchers may not know what the potential implications of their work are as they're working through a checklist. Finally, I just want to highlight that multi-stage reviews are very costly. They require experts' time, administrative resources, et cetera. And in the US, a lot of the necessary considerations for ethics reviews for AI fall outside of research ethics committees like the IRB. So our current solution relies on service from faculty panelists, which, as you can imagine, faculty are already overextended. So perhaps we need a new funding structure here that allows us to buy out faculty time or their course load to alleviate some of the burden on these overextended researchers, but also reasonably compensate their time in a way that doesn't create an obvious conflict of interest, where individual faculty might try to just consult for a number of companies for their ethics review processes. Finally, research ethics committees need to improve their capacity. Lesser resourced institutions often don't have scores of faculty that they can call on for these types of reviews. So we're looking at trying to create a collective of ethics experts that would be available to institutions that may not have them internally. And as we look at ethics at scale, one of my co-authors, David Magnus, loves to say ethics at scale is compliance. And we should consider how we can include coaching mechanisms in these review committees that can help shift the mindset of researchers, rather than seeming like these review processes are just another gate to funding that they have to complete.
Wow, that was well done. I'm good. Before I go to Dawn, someone in the Q&A said they couldn't see the panelists. Can they see them now? Did you pick that up, George? Can people see the panelists now? Anyway, just check they can. Can you answer us? And also, can people put the questions in the Q&A, not the chat? We're going to get muddled up otherwise. Have you got access? Thank you. I saw one creep into the chat. So we're going to go through our script, and I'm going to go to Dawn with the same question, Dawn, as went to Quinn.
Great, thanks, Wendy. I very much agree with what Quinn sort of mentioned there as well. So I think I'll just go into some more detail around some of those specifics. But quite simply, I think that some of these rec reviews should happen, well, they should happen as early as possible and be ongoing. It is an investment in time, but I think it really pays dividends. So if we talk about that life cycle briefly, which Andrew sort of talked about, so the design, the development, the pre and the post publication, having that ethics review at that design phase is invaluable. It's an opportunity for teams to actually reflect on what the ethical risks and issues that they see could be. And that engagement with the rec can actually help shape that thinking of the teams and their work from the outset. So you're discussing those risks, you're thinking about how they can be mitigated. And you can also be talking then about what other experts, whether they're internal or external, you should be engaging along the way. I think it's also important to note, which I think that it doesn't end when a paper is written and published or when a product is launched. It needs to be something that you continue to look at post-publication, and you need to sort of monitor those decisions and learn from them when relevant, so that you continue to improve your decision-making capability. I think in terms of the questions that it should address, I think this comes back to something else that Andrew mentioned, which is some of those principles. So the questions that it should be looking at are, how is this work meeting our sort of principles and how we want to interpret those. And interpreting the principles can also be quite complex, and where there's a lot of value in having that debate. So yeah, I think that there is huge value in sort of engaging across that life cycle and really sort of bringing those principles into play.
How do you manage it within DeepMind without giving away any secrets, Dawn?
We do have a team, sort of a dedicated team that engages with the research teams quite early on. So we tend to engage very early, work with them. We'll do workshops to understand sort of some of those ethical risks and issues, and try to sort of help think about how to mitigate those. And then we'll bring it to the equivalent of our REC if we see that as being needed.
And you keep that going beyond the end of a project, do you?
Yes, so we'll continue to monitor. Monitoring is hard, I would say. It's something that I think we always need to we need to sort of improve on and continue to learn from. But I think it is important to see how things have landed and some of the impacts that they've had. Very, very difficult sometimes.
It's really hard because sometimes, as I said, with the World Wide Web, you don't see the impacts for years.
Yeah, exactly.
AI might be faster than that. Depends what it is, really. I mean, when you think about the people that first started doing vision research, or, I mean, 30 years ago, we started computer vision. Did anybody then think about how face recognition, we all thought face recognition was an insoluble problem in the general case 30 years ago. Did anyone, anyway, so these are, sorry to keep going back. Actually, it leads us into the next question, which is addressed to Nicola and Ishmael. What has changed since you've been working in this area? Because the time thing is really important here. When something's a very early technology, you can't necessarily see what's going to be the result. And actually, the impact of that technology may well be dependent on other technologies that haven't yet been invented. Do you see what I mean? So anyway, so to Nicola and Ishmael, I'll go to Nicola first, because Nicola, what's changed since you've been in this area? How much, this is the question, has the culture of AI research or awareness of the ethical risks it raises changed? Nicola.
Yes, excuse me. Thank you for the question. I think the biggest, most important change, there's been a number of changes. The biggest, most important change has been, of course, just the awareness at the level of public discussion around the ethical issues related to these kinds of technology and research, because, of course, that provides lots of incentives to put things in motion at many different levels of society, government, and in organizations. So there's been in just the last few years, there's been quite a lot of change in terms of much more awareness to the public, much more interest and more pressures coming from regulators potentially, who are looking at various areas that are in the gray space between ethical and legal regulation, and deciding whether to claim a few problems for strict legal rules. And for sure, there's much more interest by scientists, right? In scientific communities, we've seen in professional societies, in conferences, increasing stringent requirements to face questions or ask yourselves questions related to ethics. This comes also with risks. There's the risk of ethics washing, where there's more incentives and more interest for researchers in computer science and in cognitive disciplines, for instance, to develop new technology that is just a little bit more flexible, a little bit more contextual, a little bit more smart and configurable, such that then we can call it ethical, maybe some kind of more ethical algorithm that is just a little bit more smarter in the way that we think about some kinds of ethical problems. And then, of course, there's many more organizations, especially in private sector, who are seeking to demonstrate that they take research ethics seriously, announcing various forms of audit or procedures. However, I mean, at the big picture, of course, there's very many big issues, right? As you were saying, I think you threw a big wrecking ball by saying, you know, how much in advance do we need to foresee. That is of course an issue that I don't think we are even close to having a proper idea about. But that doesn't mean that we should throw the baby with the bathwater, and so we can maybe at the moment focus on you know, smaller gains, and you know, think about really you know, not all ways of putting out new technology are equal.
Okay, yeah,
I
yeah,
think-
absolutely.
Yes.
I should pass over to Ishmael now. Unfortunately, I'd
Yeah.
love to listen to
Right.
more. We've got a lot of stuff to get through. Ishmael, your thoughts on what's changed and how it's changing.
To be honest, I think Nicola and I coordinated without speaking too much together. I just want to add maybe a few examples that help push Nicola's point. So on the one hand, in terms of how we have changed our practices in AI ethics, we now have a lot more companies out there offering algorithmic audits or algorithmic auditing as a service. Conversely, also to one of the points Nicola raised, you know, I don't want to repeat too much. Algorithmic audits have also led to what's been called algorithmic washing or audit washing. So there's this report from December, so 1 month ago somehow, look at me being on top of things, by the German Marshall Fund in the US, where they actually speak about audit washing and that being done in the EU, in EU nations. And the point there is that there's a conflict of interest between the organizations who are auditing their own algorithms. So it is ultimately a PR stance rather than anything more meaningful. Conversely, there's the increase of awareness of AI ethics amongst general public. And this is through, again, like Nicola said, technologies becoming more mainstream. So we have ChatGPT, we have text-to-image technologies. These have, by being publicly accessible, have actually allowed the public to scrutinize these technologies a bit more, be a bit more aware of the concerns they might raise. It's no longer a purely academic exercise, which I enjoyed. We actually need to think about the real impacts now. So the question now is, right, we've seen this increased public awareness. Are companies actually willing to make the changes they need to make to actually deal with that increased public awareness as we go forward?
Oh, there's so many issues here. You've raised another whole number. I need to keep pressing on. Thank you very much. I want to give follow-up questions, but the next one's to Madhu and Dawn about how tech firms are already, we've already had a bit about from Dawn about this, how tech firms are releasing products based on AI research. You raised the idea of audits and things, which will come with AI regulation, Ishmael, much more. You know, it's sort of like it's a counterpart to the ethics committees type work. But there were the question here says recently there was the news story of several news stories about ChatGPT, but one about ChatGPT being used in mental health therapy product without any ethical review. It's the same as people who use sentient analysis to detect whether people are depressed. What they're really doing is looking up people who write tweets with the word "I am depressed" in. They're not. There's, you know, these projects aren't properly ethical reviewed. So should AI products undergo ethical review? I think we would all agree with that, they should, but how is this different from research review? I think that's what this question's about. So we'll go to Madhu first, because you haven't yet had a go at this. You go first, then we'll go to Dawn.
Sure, thanks, Wendy. I'm going to cheat a little bit before I answer the question. I want to start out by quickly commending the team behind the report. Even as someone who works in this space, I find this report deeply valuable. It really helps synthesize different strands of conversations on ethics review and AI research that have been picking up momentum over the past few years. So I definitely see myself, revisiting the report many times and recommending it to people. So thank you for making this happen. Now, moving on to the question that Wendy posed, I hesitate to suggest that we need to conceive an entirely distinct process for review of AI products. That's totally distinct from research review. So this is in addition to any separate like legal compliance that an organization will have to undertake when the EU AI Act kicks in, or even when guidelines like the NIST risk management framework take effect. And I say that for a couple of reasons. So first off, there's no longer a clear line between research, dissemination, and product deployment. And that's because of the pace of development we've been seeing. So for more foundational research, I think that line between research and product is much clearer. But with the recent breakthrough capabilities around large-scale models, it's become harder to make that distinction. It appears that the window, the period of time between research and product, at least for large-scale models, is shrinking. Different model providers are following different release strategies. So really, research and product review feels more like a continuum almost. And so I think the opportunity and challenge is for actors to consider, risks of commercialization more squarely within research review to be able to better anticipate harms, because even a research release can have outsized impacts that we want to be thoughtful about. The second reason, I still think research review is a powerful lever, and it's an early lever for governance, right? With large-scale models, we recognize that risk-based regulatory approaches may not be completely effective because it's difficult to identify use cases ahead of time. It's difficult to identify emerging capabilities. So even more than before, I think researchers have an important role to play to anticipate and mitigate harms as foremost experts in their work. And finally, it bears noting that what we ultimately want is to encourage more public reporting and sharing of findings from ethics review processes. And that's, I think, a sentiment that comes across strongly in the report as well. And we want that across publication venues, academia, and especially corporate labs. So it's a worthwhile effort to understand what are some real challenges to be able to share this more widely. But I'm going to stop here and pass it to Wendy.
Yeah, so the other thing, as I pass this back to Dawn, I've already asked her a bit about how DeepMind managed, but the other thing is, of course, as you produce products, people will use that for research, applied research. And how much because there's a company responsible for what people do with their product, I think is a big issue here. Dawn. Must be an issue for DeepMind, but anyway, how would you like to answer this question?
Well, firstly, I just want to say I very much agree with Madhu's comment around this sort of research to product being a very much a continuum. I don't think that there is that distinct line now between the two. And just to be clear, yes, I definitely think that AI products should be undergoing ethical review. I think this is where we can see like a lot of that real world impact becoming very, very visible. And I think it's also worth noting that some of these, like AI products can go from very specific, so it could be something used to detect breast cancer, to very broad, so such as these large scale models, which can be used in so many different ways. I think a few ways that I can see this being different to, or like a build on the research review that we do. I think having benchmarks is really clear, a clear sort of indicator of how your product is performing. So knowing how to sort of test that AI product, being clear on the thresholds that you would want to have your product meet before it was released. And so that could be things like in the case of a large model, it could be looking at toxicity, it could be looking at correctness, could be looking at anthropomorphism, but having that clarity is really, really important. I think also being clear on the limitations as well. So some of the challenges with these AI products is they can be so general purpose. So it's, I think, where you can sort of be clear that these are the things that the model can do, these are the things that the model can't do. That sort of also helps people inform some of those use cases that they're thinking about, which I think is also something that's quite important.
Okay, now, I must keep going, mustn't I? I want to ask follow-up questions all the time, but we're going to run out of time. I'm aiming Andrew and co to go through these questions by top of the hour. So we've got a few minutes to look at the Q&A. Please keep an eye on that, panelists, and just see which ones you'd like to answer. I think we might do it that way. But anyway, we're now going to go on to something we sort of hinted at. And we're going to ask Quinn and Ishmael to pick up more on calls for multi-stage review of high-risk AI research. This is so important, and as we said, it's so hard to do over time. Because as a, you know, just an example, your product might not be an ethical risk until someone develops another technology, for example. How long do you keep these things going? What is the what's the best practice at the moment, and how might that change? Oh, sorry, I hope my husband gets that. Quinn, over to you. I'll go on to mute while the phone's mute.
Thank you. So I think first I just kind of want to answer your question a bit with a question that I have been pondering in how RACs might change to address some of these issues. And that is, you know, what mechanisms for accountability can we institutionalize for addressing ethical issues downstream? That's something that I know we've been considering through the ESR, and potentially just having an ongoing relationship between these RACs and the researchers from the development of the research question through after the point that this leaves the lab or is published. And also allowing these RACs to engage interdisciplinary experts whom you might not think would be involved in an AI project. You know, through the ESR, we've had philosophers reviewing things like the development of toxicity databases, or communication scholars engaging with work on AI art algorithms. And I find that allowing for a wide range of expertise and a little bit of speculative thinking has been really beneficial to anticipating potential downstream consequences, like questions of if you have a well-being sensing algorithm that tracks employee data, the well-meaning company may happily use that appropriately, but who owns that data and that technology if the building is sold? And allowing for some of those conversations, and really in a coaching manner with these researchers, so it doesn't come down as edicts that the RAC is issuing to these researchers who may think these experts are not really in the right purview of expertise.
Thank you. Ishmael, you were also going to answer this one.
I'll keep it brief. The only thing I wanted to add, and unfortunately, this is the one question that came through the Q&A that's been answered. Thank you, Andrew. Very thorough. But it was a question about the AI Act, and this specific, so the question that you're asking, Wendy, is about a recommendation on multi-stage review, and we specify that multi-stage review doesn't need to be for all AI development research, but for high-risk AI research. So we're asking for a more holistic, multi-stage review of high-risk research. And high-risk AI is one of the categories that the AI Act actually that we expect to be regulated. So we'll have, sorry, now I'm going to go blank, but we have 4 levels of risk for AI technologies. High risk AI is going to be AI tools used in education, border control, justice, and so on. So in these cases, what I would suggest is that the multi-stage review very much look like a holistic approach that accounts for the work that is done by other governance structures within an organization. So it doesn't only need to sit with a research ethics committee to review a project, but the review of a project, the fact that an organization centers research ethics needs to amount to legal departments, governance departments, HR, finance, everyone being a part of imbuing their processes with ethical concerns. And that maybe that's a bit of a fluffy response, but I think—
Well, I don't know. I think it ties in with what you said about audits as well. I think this will be something that's regular, as the financial audits are. It's different to that, but these things will become a regular heartbeat for most companies, whether they're applying AI or using AI, to be honest with you, and to do with data as well, how they manage their data. We aren't at that point yet. The UK AI regulation paper is the white paper's due out this quarter. It will be different to the AI Act, but we'll see. There will be some things that are all trying to achieve the same thing. It's the way we do it. Right. Okay, we have a few more questions here, although we'll see how we go. So we have a question on incentives for Nicolo and Madhu. How can different actors incentivize a culture of ethical consideration in research? What kinds of incentives need to exist in industry or academia? Well, one is you go to jail if you fail. So anyway, I mean, clearly some of this will become a crime at some point. It won't just be philosophical ethics. It will be, if your AI does something that harms people, you need to take account of it. Nicolo, how would you answer that question about incentives?
Yes, thanks. I mean, indeed, actually, regulation was one of my thoughts, one of my points, of course, especially because there are ways to regulate, as we all know, that can be quite underspecified, based on ideas about standards rather than, tick boxing rules about how to accomplish a certain kind of approach. And that can, open-ended kind of regulation can make organizations particularly risk averse because, they can be interpreted in various ways. And so one stays a bit more clearer from trouble with that. Yes, so definitely moving away from voluntary and virtuous demonstrations of ethicality. Ethics is one very important one. In general, I think another easy one is to think about resources, of course. First of all, better training and more recognition, also financial recognition for people who do the ethics support, whether reviewers and other people who do that work on that side. But also thinking about recognition for researchers, why not having research ethics awards or other kinds of ways in which excellence in research ethics can be highlighted.
Oh, sorry, go on.
I think lastly, more importantly, I think this can be achieved if we really have a kind of buy-in at various levels of society into a need for more research ethics, so that there are basically expectations that are coming across, at the crossroads. And in economies of scope, I can imagine, for instance, if we had multi-stage reviews where researchers are required to submit a broad impact statement at the end of their project and publication phase. And then we had professional societies who require, in order to present at the conference, to submit the same kind of report also. It would make it a little bit more easier for the researchers to put a little bit of time into that, since they are going to have to do the same kind of reflection twice, at the end of their projects, right? As one wraps things up in their own institution and prepares to present to their academic community. So thinking about basically how the requirements from at different levels and from different institutions can converge would be quite an incentive as well.
These are such big issues. Madhu, what's your view on incentives?
Yeah, in agreement with what Nicolo suggested, just one piece that I want to add is, for industry, one set of incentives we can consider is, developing some sort of common protocols for responsible research, innovation, and deployment, which includes consensus around research review and its components like stakeholder engagement. Some AI research labs are making progress internally already in developing best practices for reviewing research for ethical and societal impact. We've heard that from Andrew, we've heard that from Don, that there's been progress at DeepMind on these questions, but there's still no common baseline or standard yet for the entire industry. So I think working to establish that, while no doubt challenging, can really help move the needle forward for industry actors at least.
Thank you. We've got a question here on broader social impact. And how can REX assess future impacts? What models might exist for this? We've touched on some of this, so I'll just ask Quinn, Don, and Madhu to say if anything more to say on this. Quinn?
Yeah, so in addition to some of the points we've touched on, one thing that I think could be helpful is for collaborations between REX across institutions and organizations to learn from the issues that each organization is identifying, and also ensuring that the experts that we engage are keeping up to date on the robust literatures that have been developed on potential ethical issues that come out of some of these technologies, and be able to point researchers to some of these areas to further engage.
Can I pick up on, so we can cut time just a bit, on question 7, which is about what sort of informal support can Rex offer researchers? Particularly, I'm thinking about young PhD students here. What's your answer to that? I'd say training, education. What would you say to that? How is Stanford trying to do this with your young researchers?
Definitely through training. And some of the informal surveys I've done with researchers, everyone will say they feel faculty are pretty well trained, but graduate students definitely aren't.
Yeah.
So that is something, a little bit of an anomaly there, but it's something that we're really trying to work to engage both, burgeoning postdocs in the area of ethics on a variety of issues to engage in some initial reviews through the Ethics and Society review process, but then also through some mock ESR sessions that I've done with students in courses. I'm doing one with a group at Queen's University, Canada next weekend to try to get them just comfortable asking these questions and thinking about where things could go wrong and recognize that you can be a well-meaning researcher and still make mistakes and how to recover from that.
I would argue academic staff aren't prepared for this either, let alone the students they're supervising. So Dawn, anything more on broader societal impact from you? Your stuff is so far-reaching that you do.
It's I mean, we've talked about the fact that things are moving so quickly. So I think, trying to anticipate what those future impacts can be quite challenging. So it needs to be like a continuous and a constant sort of conversation. So I think some of the things that we think about are like drawing on the knowledge of interdisciplinary groups that can provide that input to the REC. So that involves having a team that's dedicated to support the REC with doing that deeper analysis on risks and being able to document those and provide those to the REC to kind of deliberate upon. I think it's also being able to create, like we talk about creating this muscle around bringing these different groups with the right expertise together to discuss these projects and the risks associated with them. We really believe in the importance of bringing some of that external expertise in to help inform those conversations as well. That could be external research, or it could be external experts that we engage. And I think, like we also want to be able to involve the views of impacted communities and groups. So pulling that all together starts to help to anticipate some of those future impacts, but also then we can start to think about how do we actually start to mitigate some of those. And I think, the other thing for an REC to consider is just to stay abreast of all those changes. And that's hard as well.
Oh, so that's really important. I mean, when you think this is forever, this isn't just like, how do we tackle it in the next 5-10 years? Madhu, any last thoughts from you?
Just one piece kind of adding on to what Dawn pointed out is that we really need venues for multi-stakeholder dialogue. So that needs to be across venues. And we've seen other fields kind of consider these venues, especially bioethics. And we really need these venues for 2 reasons, right? We need to build consensus around the necessity for ethics review. It's not a foregone conclusion. There are still many venues that haven't adopted processes around this yet. And we really need multi-stakeholder dialogue to be able to consider, latest advances and how to update our ethics review processes to keep pace accordingly. So I know this is easier said than done, but even an annual recurring workshop, at the sidelines of an AI conference can really help establish the momentum and help us build that, muscle for diverse, dialogue that's really necessary to make progress on ethics review in AI research.
Absolutely. Ishmael, what last thoughts from you without going through the specific questions there? Any last thoughts from you on societal impact or how we help with informal as well as formal reviews?
Training is going to be key. I think the formal informal division can be helped by the fact, and you'll know this, within universities, you have your research ethics committee within, hopefully, a broader governance department. That allows for governance support staff who aren't part of the review process, which we need to we would ideally keep safeguarded from conflicts of interest. So you have the review process, which is quite encapsulated, quite narrow. You have those support staff who can then create whatever the mentorship programs, create the workshops, look for the conferences to give their workshops. And that's the informal aspect of things.
Thanks, Ismail. Nicola, last word to you on this round.
Yes, well, I think to do informal and formal and how to handle that is quite important to have a good number of experts available, so that basically the same people can, depending on different projects, can have different role. One, sometimes be the formal mentor, as the formal reviewer, and sometimes the informal mentor. It's important that the both of the functions are still rigorous, right? Because if you introduce informal ethics support, you don't want to basically undermine your ability to to really monitor and examine and audit the ethics of your research projects.
I agree. I think myself personally that we will increasingly teach this material in courses across the university, pan-university support, where we teach about AI for everybody, not just the STEM students, and we'll include the whole ethics process as part of that education piece, but we're not ready for that yet.
Yes. Well, increasingly there is, I think, research ethics. I've seen it increasingly integrated in education in computer science degrees.
Yes, but only in computer science degrees. You see, but it is needed. It needed. Lots of other people need to understand it too. But yes, it is beginning to appear in computer science. Yeah.
Ultimately, for informal and formal to be done both well, there needs to be this commitment between the separation of the two functions of auditing and support, and I think resources. Yeah. Resources.
Right. So I'm sorry to cut you off there, but we should do. There have been some great questions, some of which have already been answered. How do you want to handle this? Is there any that people would like to? I think there's an anonymous one there which caught my eye about how ethics panels can create partnerships between private sector groups and academic sources. I mean, I think, increasingly in universities, we are expecting people to turn their research into products. Any comment there about the university industry? I mean, can universities import in some way what's happening in industry to help us understand how to teach people what to do with AI ethics? Anyone want to pick that up, or am I just? Nope, they're all smiling. Ishmael, yes, go on. And then
I'll suggest one thing, and we used to do this when I managed the research ethics process at the Turing. The conversations that we'd have with partners who came through the hackathons, we used to run a series of hackathons. The conversation held with them, because we had to go through this review process, this ethics review process, would make it very clear that we have certain standards. So there was some sort of back and forth about the ethics of what they're asking us to do. That might not be as strong an intervention as you might have in mind, but it's one way. It's a way to have the conversation, at least.
Now there's another one which I think actually everyone could address, which is they're all good questions. Forgive me, we haven't got time to tackle them all. But someone sent in a question that says, yeah, we're talking about long-term issues here. We have been a lot. What would you recommend should, it says we are confronting these challenges now without much resource, that's in universities. If you had to prioritize a key action to take in the next 6 months to enhance university ethics review of AI data science projects, what would it be? This is like, if you've ever listened, oh yes, these quizzes say in the last minute, this is your question time, does it on the TV? Okay, so what can be done? What's the most important thing to do now? Who wants to take that first, or am I just going to pick on someone?
I
Well-
can take a stab at that first. if that
Go
works.
on, Quinn, and I think it's
Well,
a big question for everyone to answer.
I'm cheating a bit because I think I'm going off of some stuff that Madhu had mentioned. But I think highlighting how central these reviews are to conducting ethical and socially responsible research first and foremost is really important, because a lot of these recs rely, especially for AI ethics reviews, rely in some form on self-selection into the process. So encouraging researchers and demonstrating to them what potential pitfalls may look like if they don't actually go through these processes is important.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Madhu then next. Anything? What would you say to my university ethics committee? They should make sure they've done. Of course, you don't know what it's like, but I can assure you it doesn't do this very well. None of them do at the moment.
I was just going to, Quinn was being kind. I think they said it better than I did at the first instance. I think if there's just one thing you can do, for some reason there's, you can't do multiple things, but just one singular thing. I think, including a statement in your research around potential societal impacts is helpful. Having some form of ethical analysis, as a part of your final published paper. It doesn't have to be right. There's no right way to do it, but I think it's a start. So I'd probably advocate for that.
That sounds very good. I'm going through my head how we'd implement that at the university. What's the final published paper of a project? But your point is, I totally agree with your general point. I'm just going through how would you actually, I mean, even a PhD student, their work doesn't finish just as they submit their thesis. And I don't most PhD, certainly in my experience, most PhD students do not have proper training about how to do the research analysis, the ethics analysis of the implications of their work. I don't know if those words were in the right order, but you know what I mean. And I do think every PhD thesis, every research proposal we should start insisting on this. The ACM, I'm now co-chair of publications, and we're beginning to a co-chair of the publications board for ACM, and we're beginning to insist on that for every paper, beginning to. Right, I'm going to go to Dawn and then Nicolo for thoughts on what's the most important thing to do in the short term.
I would agree with what Quinn and Madhu have suggested. I think also there's a great opportunity to kind of learn from how the industry is evolving. There are quite a number of case studies out there around things that are working and things that aren't. And I think that we as an industry are learning all together. There's a lot that we can researchers can learn from that and think about how their work will potentially have an impact on the world.
Hard. Nicola, any last thoughts?
Yes, I wanted to address this question also because it mentions, without much resource. And the last thing I said was about increasing the resources. And well, I thought, if I assume that the question is really the resources aren't going to change, we're not going to get more money to do things, including maybe to implement a multi-stage review process, because it takes a little bit of meetings and time to just figure that out. I just thought maybe the cheapest and effective thing to do would be to try to involve more people and more diverse people, both in terms of professional expertise and also experiential expertise, or in terms of positionality in the review process. And that shouldn't revolutionize too much of your ethics review, but it can really bring in what Quinn was already saying earlier on, I think, about involving different experts and being surprised.
Yes, I'm going to come back to that in my closing remarks. Ishmael, I'm going to give the last word to you. Anything you want to add on this short term? What do we do next? What's the most important thing to do next?
I'm going to give a cheeky answer. Just seek independent advice. You need an outsider to help you out. But I think that interdisciplinarity and, like Nicola was saying, diversity of the people in those conversations is going to be key.
And sharing between institutions and academia and industry. I'm going to finish by saying that I forgot what I'm going to finish. It was a really important point there. But what were we talking about?
About involving more people.
God, it was a really important point. Say that again.
about
lost my thread.
involving different experts.
Oh, yes, exactly. Yes. And Wendy Grossman, who I know well, just put something in the chat about teaching ethics to MBAs. That was the point I was making earlier, that it isn't just computer sciences, science people, students, staff are the worst at thinking about these sorts of issues. They don't think about, a lot of them don't think about people or society, and they're not trained to in many ways. And it's so important to have interdisciplinary teams looking at this, and I would say do it from a socio-technical point of view, and making sure that we teach this. So as you say, Wendy, MBAs, because they're the people that are going to go out and run the businesses, the business studies, the people, the medics that need to understand this type of research, the engineers generally, science across the board. So, and we need the expertise from the social scientists and the philosophers and the psychologists, and this has to be an interdisciplinary thing. I'm going to finish. We have 1 minute to go. Last word to Andrew, but I'm just going to say, you were a fabulous panel. As I say, each one of you I could have listened to for hours, or certainly an hour. I think that's I could have listened to for a full keynote. And I want to congratulate Andrew and the whole team for putting this panel together. It's been fabulous. Andrew, last word to you.
Thanks so much, Wendy. And thanks again so much to our panelists. I feel like this is the kind of conversation we need to have a lot more of in the recent like an ongoing, never ending conversation. So it's wonderful to have everyone here.
We're being asked for a part 2. So I don't stop there, but
expectations for that quite yet. But I just want to thank all of you for joining us as well. Thank you so much for participating and for listening in, and we will see you at the next event. Everyone have a lovely night. Take care.
Bye, everybody.